Whether from the left in Orwell's case or from the right in the case of thinkers such as Russell Kirk, the enemy was the same. And what needed to be defended were the permanent things.
When we think of the permanent things, we think back through Russell Kirk all the way back to Edmund Burke, and they both being Englishmen. Or was Orwell ever on the record in terms of how he felt about the works of Edmund Burke?
He never formally addressed himself to the work of Edmund Burke. However, Orwell made it clear that he was a rebel against orthodoxy, against tyranny, against injustice in all its forms. He was not a revolutionary. A revolutionary seeks to overthrow a system and typically then institutes another system, eventually becoming equally perverse. A revolutionary inevitably leads to counter-revolution, and so violence spills in the street and blood is everywhere. A rebel is someone who is against, and having been against is satisfied once having launched the salvo to stop right there. And so, Orwell was Burkean to this extent. Just as Burke, in his reflections on the Revolution in France, was responding against the French Revolution, was a rebel against the way in which violence and blood in the streets had been spilled in the name of these abstract ideals of the French Revolution that had become so quickly perverted. So too was Burke a rebel. A rebel against these smelly little orthodoxies competing for our souls. Orwell's famous closing line in his essay on Charles Dickens. Orwell was part of the second great conservative movement in modern Western history. That is, the first great movement was indeed in the wake of the French Revolution. And its first proponent was Edmund Burke. In the 19th century, in the wake of Burke's critique of the French Revolution, came influential conservative thinkers in all European countries. In Germany, Hegel. In Austria, Halal. In France, Boland, de Maistre. In England, Coleridge and Southey, and others. The second great conservative movement arose after a similar revolution on the American shores. That is, after the Marxist 1930s and FDR's New Deal and the upheaval from World War II, a new intellectual climate had emerged. And in the 1950s and 60s, in the wake of the publication of books such as 1984, Orwell joined conservative thinkers such as Russell Kirk, Peter Viereck, Robert Nisbet, and many others, Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, and eventually even neoconservatives such as Irving Kristol, Ramaphosa Horace, and others. All of them reacting against the dangers of liberalism turning into a radicalism and a communism, as represented by some of the excessive figures in the New Left, such as by the late 1960s, the Weathermen. All of this is part of the cultural climate of the 1950s and 60s. The conservative movement arises in reaction against that, as well as in the wake of the upheavals following the New Deal and World War II. And that is the second great conservative moment in the last several centuries. In some ways, equal in its importance and impact to the conservative moment and great movement that arose in the 19th century after the French Revolution, and it's critiqued by Edmund Burke.
That's outstanding. So many of the lessons that today they seem to have gone down Winston Smith's memory hole about just how bad that French Revolution was. And I wonder, speaking of Winston Smith's job at the Ministry of Truth, is it alive today? Do we see here in America with so much of the mainstream media, what would you think that Orwell's prescription would be to handle the Ministry of Truth as it exists today?